Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. I'd like to welcome you, dear viewers, to another in our series, Studies in Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May Allah's peace and blessings be on each and every one of you. In this series, we are looking at the four major areas of Islamic disciplines. We looked at Aqidah, which is the theological basis for Islam. We looked at Tafsir, which is the interpretation of the Quran. And we looked at Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, which are particularly relevant to the life of a Muslim from a legal perspective, as well as from a moral perspective and social perspectives, etc. Then we have looked at, or began to look at, the area of Islamic law. We actually went through the foundations of Islamic law, the basic principles, which are the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma, that is the consensus of opinion of the scholars, and Qiyas, deduction by way of analogy. And we looked at the 5 rulings concerning all issues and things, which is known as the halal and the haram, and its elements, and how those rulings came to be. And in our previous session, we were looking at the reasons that there were differences amongst the scholars. Because if we have this common foundation which is all agreed upon, so where would differences come from? And I explained that differences come from, in general, interpretations, interpretational differences. And where these interpretational differences lie, and scholars differ in their interpretations, then these differences are acceptable as long as there is evidence for and support for the different opinions. If there is no support, I mean, beyond human rationale or reason, opinions, etc., then those differences we look at as being not acceptable differences. I mean, a person may make a ruling because he has no evidence. He makes a ruling based on whatever he thinks. Just his intuition tells him this may be the better choice. But once we have another ruling where there is evidence to support that ruling, then it has to be given precedence. So when we looked at the differences, we looked at differences which occurred concerning words and their meanings. We pointed out how certain words had shared literal meanings. Words in Arabic, some of them have 2 meanings. Just as the same way in English, you can have the word bow. Bow could mean a bow tie, that you tie something into a bow, or it could mean the bow from the bow and the arrow, or it could be the word bow, written the same way. Bow could mean the act of bowing, or it could mean the bow, in sound-wise, the front part of a ship. So in that way, words in English, when said, could carry different meanings depending on the context. Similarly, in Arabic, you have words which had same written form or same said form, but having more than one meaning. And we also have words which had literal meanings as well as figurative meanings. And that one has to take into account. Some scholars would go by the literal meaning of a particular text and say, well, this is what was intended, this is what was said, this is what was intended. We go with the text. Others would say, but no, there is an intent behind this text, and it's not, we don't take it on face value. We take what was intended by the text. This is the basis for difference. And we also had, even from a grammatical perspective, that constructions, certain grammatical constructions in Arabic, could have more than one implication. So scholars, looking at the constructions, some concluded it had one meaning, some concluded it had another. And as we said, in general, where there are evidence is to support the differences, then these are acceptable differences. And the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, had said that if the ruler or the judge strives to find the correct ruling, he makes an effort. The term used is ijtahada. He makes ijtihad. He strives to find the right ruling. And he is incorrect. Allah will reward him still with one reward for his intention and for his effort. If he strives and is correct, he gets two rewards, one for the effort and one for being correct. So in that way, differences which are a product of scholastic efforts to arrive at the correct ruling, these are tolerated, accepted. People do have the right to make a decision based on the evidence that supports their interpretation. However, if clear evidence comes, because the difference may be, say, linguistic, and we find support for each linguistic position, but then we have an additional evidence come from a statement of a companion of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, for example, or another statement by the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him himself, which ends the discussion, where there is no room for interpretation. He has already said what it is. In such cases, then, it is not acceptable for one to cling on to that opinion, which was valid initially when there was no clear evidence to resolve it. Now, to cling on to that is to cling on to falsehood, and that is not acceptable. The second major area of differences had to do with the narrations of hadiths themselves. We know, as we mentioned earlier, that the major scholars who were the founders of the schools of Islamic law, they were from the third generation. The first generation being that of the companions of the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him. The second generation being known as the tabi'un, or the successors, the students of the Sahaba, or the companions. And the third generation, referred to as the tabi'ut tabi'in, or atba'ut tabi'in, different terms for them, meaning the students of the successors, or the successors of the successors. These different terms are used. Anyway, that third generation was where Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmed ibn Hanbal, towards the end of it, were from that generation. Now, we should note that in that generation, the compilation of hadiths was limited. I mean, compilation was being done. Scholars of that era in their various areas, Al-Awza'i in Syria, Sufyan al-Thawri, in Abu Hanifa in Iraq, Al-Layth ibn Sa'd in Egypt. The scholars were, Imam Malik in Medina, scholars in different areas made their own compilation. And from that era, the only complete compilation of hadiths of a scholar of that time was that of Al-Muwatta of Imam Malik. He in Medina had compiled a text which was narrated by a number of different students of his, written down, etc. His compilation of hadiths, known as Al-Muwatta, is the earliest complete compilation to reach us. Now, this is the third generation. Some people might mistakenly think, oh, this is some 200 years after the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But no, this is not the case at all. Imam Malik's grandfather was a Sahabi. His grandfather was a Sahabi. Now, he did not learn from his grandfather directly, because had he done so, he would be considered a tabi'i, a successor, a student of the Sahaba, and not a student of the students of the Sahaba. But still, the gap is very small. It's no 200 years. we're talking about a generation or less. So this is compilation in written form to get to us. It doesn't mean that there wasn't compilation being done in the time of the tabi'een, and there was. Because of the narrations of hadiths, the major narrators of the top 12 narrators of hadiths, for example, 9 out of the 12 of their 9 of those companions out of the 12, the top 12, their students were known to record the hadiths that they got from them. And the companions themselves were known to record hadiths. So the recording of hadiths was taking place from the time of the Sahaba itself and continued on down, right? Increasing in volume as the generations passed. Anyway, the point that we're making here is that in the time of the Atba' Tabi'een, when the major scholars arose and had their own compilations, each scholar tended to have the rulings that were handed down from the companions who had been in his area. Because the companions, as time passed from the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, did spread out. Some ended up in Egypt, some went on to Syria, some were in Iraq, some were in Medina, Mecca, etc. So naturally, the scholars that arose in those various areas, they would have compiled the hadiths mostly of their areas. Some of them did travel and of course compiled from more than one area, maybe 2 or 3 areas. Like Imam Shafi'i, he compiled from Medina, he also compiled from Iraq, and he also compiled from Egypt, so he had a larger compilation. Anyway, the point is that naturally, with the scholars not having gathered these texts at that time, and that the major gathering took place in the generation after them. This is the generation of the Sahihs, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim. These are the major books in which all of the hadiths were now being gathered and sifted, the authentic clearly identified from the inauthentic. Of course, Imam Malik in his own compilation was pretty stringent in the principles he followed in gathering, so most of his hadiths were also authentic anyway. But it was a limited compilation. You know, when we look at Sahih Bukhari, which has over 7,000 hadith narrations, and we look at Al-Muwatta, whose total number of narrations is right down to 1,000 plus narrations, of course it's a vast difference between the two. Anyway, as we said, scholars naturally would have made rulings based on what was available to them of hadiths. So you find rulings, for example, like Abu Hanifa, he ruled that the istisqa, Salatul Istisqa, the prayer for rain, did not include the formal prayer. It was only a dua, a supplication which would be made. And this was based on the position that Anas ibn Malik had narrated that on a particular occasion, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had made a supplication without making the formal prayer. This was an incident, an occasion which took place. However, there were other narrations where the whole formal prayer was completely described. So Abu Hanifa, based on what had come to him from Anas ibn Malik, he ruled that the Salat al-Istisqa is just a dua, just a supplication, that's all. No formal prayer. However, his own students, the students of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani, they both agreed with the position of the other scholars, Malik, Ahmed and Shafi'i, may Allah's peace be on them all. They agreed with them that in fact there was a formal prayer to be done. And this was of course narrated by Abbad ibn Tamim, and also that when the prayer was completed and the imam and the people went back, they would reverse their garments, right? This was the part of the sunnah or practices of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with regards to the prayer for rain. So here we had a case of narrations not reaching an imam, him making a ruling based on what he had. Later on, his own students changed their position from his to that of the other imams because they found the evidence that the other imams had. The second area of difference could come now also from the classification of the hadiths themselves. That, as you know or may not know, hadiths are classified into different levels. Basically, the authentic and the inauthentic, the sahih and the da'if. That's the major difference between the two. Those which are sahih are the ones which may be used for Islamic law. Those which are da'if or weak, inaccurate, they may not be used for points of Islamic law. Now, a hadith may come to a scholar in a way which appears to him to be authentic. He's not aware of everything about the hadith, and as such, he judges it to be authentic, and then he makes a ruling on the basis of it. Later on, others may find or others may show that no, this hadith is in fact not authentic. And there is an authentic one which doesn't agree with it. Or there is nothing on the topic, so no ruling should be made in that respect. An example of that can also be found in Imam Abu Hanifa and Ahmed ibn Hanbal's position that wudu, or the state of purity produced by the ablution, wudu, washing the hands, face, feet, that this state of purity, or tahara, is broken when a person vomits. If a person is forced into vomiting, you had the feeling you vomited, then you had to make wudu over again. And this is based on a narration attributed to Aisha, in which she reports that the Prophet ﷺ had said, "Whoever is afflicted with vomiting should leave the prayer, if it happened to them in prayer, make wudu, then continue where he left off without speaking during the interval." This particular narration is found in Ibn Majah, the Sunan of Ibn Majah. However, it is not an authentic narration. And as such, the position held by Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Malik that vomit does not break wudu is the more authentic one. And this is based on, one, the fact that the hadith which the other scholars used was not authentic. Secondly, that when the Prophet, may God's peace and blessing be upon him, specified the things which broke wudu, there's some narrations in which he mentioned wudu is broken by passing wind, urine, urinating, defecating, and sexual relations. He specifically mentioned these, grouped them. There was no mention of vomit in those narrations at all. So on the basis of that, the correct ruling would be that held by Imam Shafi'i and Imam Malik. So in this way, of course, when a person comes across issues like this, they're obliged to follow the evidence. They're not obliged to follow, even though they may have been brought up according to the Hanafi school of thought or the Hanbali school of thought. When the evidence comes to them, what they're obliged to do is to follow the evidence. With that, dear viewers, we'd like to thank you for being with us in this segment of our program, Studies in Islam. And we hope that you'll follow the program throughout the year. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.